Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Whisper. Derek Morrison had built his life on two fundamental principles. Loyalty earned loyalty, and betrayal demanded retribution. At 42, he commanded respect in every room he entered. 6 feet of controlled power wrapped in expensive suits, with steel-gray eyes that could read a person's intentions before they knew them themselves. His success in commercial real estate had come not from inherited wealth or lucky breaks, but from an ability to identify weakness and exploit it ruthlessly. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of his home office, illuminating spreadsheets and contracts that represented millions in ongoing deals. Derek prided himself on controlling every variable, anticipating every possibility, which made what happened next all the more devastating. Tyler, his 6-year-old son, slipped into the office with the quiet stealth only children possessed when they sensed danger. The boy's usually bright eyes were wide with something Derek had never seen there before: fear. Without a word, Tyler closed the door with careful precision and approached his father's desk. "Dad," Tyler whispered, his small voice barely audible. "Under the desk. Don't make a sound." Something in his son's tone triggered every instinct Derek had honed through years of high-stakes negotiations. This wasn't a game. He slid his chair back and squeezed under the mahogany desk alongside Tyler, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cramped space felt suffocating, but he remained perfectly still. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, Claudia's distinctive click of heels on hardwood, accompanied by heavier, unfamiliar steps. Derek's wife was supposed to be at her book club, the same Wednesday routine she'd maintained for 3 years. The same routine that had never involved bringing anyone home. "The office is at the end of the hall," Claudia's voice carried clearly. "Derek's in Chicago until tomorrow night. We have plenty of time." Derek's blood turned to ice. Chicago. He'd canceled that trip 2 days ago due to a client emergency, something Claudia knew perfectly well since she'd been irritated about their dinner reservations being wasted. "You sure he won't be back early?" The man's voice was deep, confident. "I'd hate to have an awkward conversation with your husband about property values." Claudia laughed, a sound Derek had once found musical but now recognized as practiced deception. "Trust me, Derek's predictable as clockwork. Besides, he's so buried in work lately, he wouldn't notice if I redecorated the entire house." Tyler's small hand found Derek's arm, squeezing gently. The child's instincts had been right. This was dangerous territory, but not in the way Tyler understood. The footsteps moved past the office toward the master bedroom. Derek heard the door close, followed by Claudia's laughter again, more intimate this time. His hands clenched into fists, every muscle coiled with barely contained rage. But Derek Morrison wasn't a man who acted on impulse. Fury was a tool, not a master. As the sounds from down the hall made his son press closer to him in confusion, Derek's mind began to work with cold precision. Claudia thought she was playing a game where only she knew the rules. She was about to learn how wrong she was. After what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes, the voices moved back toward the front of the house. Derek caught fragments: plans for next week, complaints about Derek's long hours, intimate jokes he wasn't meant to hear. The front door closed, and Derek waited another 10 minutes before emerging from under the desk. Tyler looked up at him with worried eyes. "Dad, are you okay? You look scary." Derek forced his expression into something resembling normalcy and lifted his son onto his lap. "Tyler, that was very smart, what you did. Can you tell me why you thought we should hide?" The boy fidgeted with Derek's tie. "I came home early from Grandma's because my tummy hurt. I saw Mommy with that man, and they were kissing like in the movies. But not like you and Mommy kiss. And Mommy looked different. Like when she's pretending to like my drawings, but doesn't really." Even at 6, Tyler could read people better than most adults. Derek felt a surge of pride mixed with bitter irony. His son had inherited his ability to see through deception, which meant Tyler would never be naive enough to trust blindly. It was a harsh gift for a child, but perhaps a necessary one. "Did Mommy see you?" Derek asked carefully. Tyler shook his head. "I hid by the stairs first. That's when I heard them coming up here. I knew you were working, so I came to tell you." Derek hugged his son close, his mind already spinning possibilities. Claudia had been careful, but not careful enough. She'd underestimated her audience, both her husband and her son. It was a mistake that would cost her everything. "Tyler, this needs to be our secret for now, okay? Grown-up stuff can be complicated, and I need to figure some things out before we talk to Mommy. Tyler nodded solemnly. Are you going to be sad? The question hit deeper than Derek expected. Would he be sad? He examined his emotions like a surgeon probing a wound. Anger, yes. Betrayal, certainly. Fury at being played for a fool, absolutely. But sadness? No. Claudia had made her choice, and now Derek would make his. I might be, he said finally. But you don't need to worry about that. That's my job to handle. As Tyler scampered off to play, Derek sat alone in his office, the familiar space now feeling like enemy territory. Everything looked the same, but the foundation of his life had just shifted beneath his feet. Claudia thought she was clever, sneaking around behind his back. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who had never lost a battle that mattered. Derek opened his laptop and began typing. If Claudia wanted to play games, he'd show her what a master looked like. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Deception. Derek Morrison had always believed that knowledge was the ultimate weapon, and over the next week, he gathered intelligence with the methodical precision of a general planning a siege. His 20-year marriage to Claudia suddenly felt like ancient history as he examined it with new eyes, looking for the cracks he'd been blind to see. The revelation shouldn't have surprised him as much as it did. Claudia had been distant for months, canceling their dinner dates and finding excuses to avoid family time. Her book club meetings had become more frequent, her phone calls more secretive. She'd started working out obsessively and had bought new clothes, expensive ones that she claimed were for feeling good about herself. All classic signs he'd somehow rationalized away. Derek had met Claudia 15 years ago at a charity gala where she'd been working as an event coordinator. She was stunning, blonde, blue-eyed, with a smile that could light up a room and a laugh that drew people like moths to flame. She'd seemed genuinely impressed by his success, hanging on his words as he described his latest property acquisitions. Within 6 months, they were married. Looking back now, Derek wondered if he'd ever really known her or if he'd simply fallen in love with the image she projected. Claudia had always been skilled at being what people wanted her to be. The perfect wife at business dinners, the devoted mother at school events, the sophisticated woman at social gatherings. Perhaps her affair was just another performance, another role she'd decided to play. The man she'd brought home was easier to identify than Derek had expected. A few discreet inquiries at Claudia's gym, where she'd recently started spending more time, led him to Brian Hutchinson. 38, divorced, worked as a personal trainer and part-time model for local advertising campaigns. The kind of man who collected married women like trophies and moved on when the excitement wore off. Derek's research revealed that Brian had a pattern. 3 previous affairs with married clients, all ending when the women either got caught or the relationships became too complicated. He was handsome in an obvious way, all muscle and white teeth and practice charm. Everything Derek wasn't, which probably made him irresistible to a woman bored with her successful but workaholic husband. But Brian Hutchinson had made one crucial mistake. He'd chosen the wrong man's wife. Derek spent his days maintaining his normal routine while his evenings were devoted to surveillance. He hired a private investigator, Marcus Webb, a former police detective with a reputation for discretion and thoroughness. Within 72 hours, Marcus had provided Derek with a detailed timeline of the affair. It had been going on for 4 months. They met twice a week at various motels around the city, always on days when Derek was scheduled to be at the office late or traveling. Claudia had even used Derek's business trips as opportunities for overnight encounters, claiming she was visiting her sister in Portland while actually spending weekends with Brian in luxury hotels. The financial records told their own story. Claudia had been using their joint credit card for expenses she thought Derek wouldn't notice. Expensive dinners, hotel rooms, even gifts for Brian. She'd been sloppy, confident in Derek's trust and his habit of leaving household financial management to her. Most damning of all were the text messages Marcus had managed to retrieve. Claudia's phone records revealed hundreds of messages between her and Brian, filled with intimate details about their relationship and cruel jokes about Derek's obliviousness. One message in particular burned itself into Derek's memory. He's so focused on his deals, he wouldn't notice if I moved Brian into the guest room. Sometimes I think he loves those contracts more than he loves me. The bitter irony was that Claudia might have been right. Derek had thrown himself into work with increasing intensity over the past year, partly to provide for his family, but also to avoid dealing with the growing distance in their marriage. He'd assumed it was a temporary rough patch, something that would resolve itself once he closed the Henderson development deal or finished the Morrison Plaza project. Instead, his absence had created the perfect opportunity for betrayal. As Derek studied the evidence, a cold clarity settled over him. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis. This was calculated deception, carried out with careful planning and complete disregard for their family. Claudia had made her choice deliberately, repeatedly, over months. She'd looked at their life together, weighed it against her desires, and found it wanting. Now Derek would show her the true cost of that decision. The plan began to form in his mind like a building taking shape from blueprints. It would need to be comprehensive, devastating, and absolutely legal. Derek had spent years learning how to destroy his business opponents within the bounds of the law, and those same skills would serve him well now. But first, he needed to secure Tyler's future. Whatever happened between Derek and Claudia, their son was innocent. Derek contacted his attorney, Helen Rodriguez, and began quietly restructuring his assets. If Claudia thought she could take half of everything he'd built, she was about to discover how wrong she was. The custody battle would be vicious, but Derek held significant advantages. His steady income, his involvement in Tyler's life, and most importantly, Tyler's own testimony about what he'd witnessed. Claudia's affair had handed Derek the strongest possible position in any divorce proceeding. As for Brian Hutchinson, Derek had special plans for him. The man thought he was playing a simple game: seduce a wealthy man's wife, enjoy the perks, and move on when things got complicated. Brian had no idea he'd stepped into a trap that Derek was only beginning to construct. By week's end, Derek had assembled a complete picture of his enemies and their weaknesses. Claudia's vanity, her need for social approval, her assumption that Derek would be a passive victim. Brian's pattern of predatory behavior, his financial instability, his dependence on his reputation to maintain his business. They'd given Derek everything he needed to destroy them both. On Friday evening, as Claudia prepared for another book club meeting, Derek watched her apply makeup with new eyes. She was beautiful, he had to admit. But beauty without loyalty was just an attractive shell hiding a rotten core. "Have fun tonight," he said, kissing her cheek with practiced affection. "Oh, you know how it is," Claudia replied, avoiding his eyes. "Just discussing the latest romance novel. Nothing exciting." Derek smiled genuinely for the first time in days. "I'm sure it's more interesting than you think." Chapter 3: The Foundation Cracks. 3 weeks after the discovery, Derek Morrison sat in his office reviewing the final pieces of his plan like a chess master examining the board before checkmate. Every move had been calculated, every contingency prepared for. Claudia and Brian had no idea they were already trapped in a web of their own making. The beauty of Derek's approach was its elegance. He wouldn't need to fabricate evidence or manipulate situations artificially. His enemies were providing all the ammunition themselves. Derek was simply positioning himself to make the most devastating use of it. The first phase had been information gathering, and Marcus Webb had exceeded expectations. Not only had he documented the affair in exhaustive detail, but he'd uncovered something even more valuable. Brian Hutchinson wasn't just a serial adulterer. He was a con artist with ambitions far beyond simple seduction. Brian had been systematically grooming Claudia for a larger score. The text messages Marcus had retrieved revealed plans that went far beyond a casual affair. Brian was pushing Claudia to convince Derek to invest in a luxury fitness center that Brian claimed to be developing. The proposal was legitimate looking but ultimately fraudulent, a sophisticated scheme to separate Derek from a significant portion of his wealth. "Your husband's smart," one of Brian's messages read. "But even smart guys get stupid when their wives ask for favors. You're beautiful enough to make him overlook a few red flags." Claudia's responses showed she was fully complicit in the plan. She'd already begun laying groundwork, mentioning to Derek how impressed she was with Brian's business acumen, and suggesting they should meet. The plan was to have Derek accidentally encounter Brian at the gym, where Claudia would facilitate an introduction that would seem natural. Derek felt a cold satisfaction reading these exchanges. They'd handed him the perfect justification for what was coming next. The second phase had been protecting his assets. Helen Rodriguez had worked miracles with the family finances. legally restructuring Derek's holdings through a maze of trusts and corporations that would be nearly impossible for Claudia to touch in a divorce. The family home, ostensibly their most valuable shared asset, was actually owned by one of Derek's companies and leased to them for a nominal fee, a detail buried in paperwork Claudia had never bothered to examine. More importantly, Derek had documented every expense related to Claudia's affair. Hotel rooms, dinners, gifts, all paid for with marital funds. In their state's divorce laws, dissipation of marital assets was grounds for significant penalties. Claudia had essentially been stealing from herself. But the financial aspects were just groundwork. Derek's real masterpiece lay in the psychological warfare he was about to unleash. The key was understanding his opponent's weaknesses. Claudia craved social status and approval. Her identity was built on being seen as the perfect wife and mother. Brian depended on his reputation as a desirable, successful man to maintain his predatory lifestyle. Derek would attack both pillars simultaneously. Phase 3 began with a dinner party. Derek announced to Claudia that he wanted to host an elegant evening for his most important clients and their spouses, the kind of social event Claudia lived for. She threw herself into planning with enthusiasm, seeing it as an opportunity to showcase her skills as a hostess. She had no idea Derek had invited several private investigators, family law attorneys, and key members of their social circle specifically to witness what was about to unfold. The guest list was a masterpiece of strategic selection. Derek included the wives of his business partners, women who formed the core of their social group's gossip network. He invited the headmaster of Tyler's private school and several prominent members of their country club. Each person had been chosen for maximum impact when the truth came to light. Claudia suspected nothing. She spent days preparing, hiring caterers and florists, selecting the perfect dress, calling her hairdresser. She even suggested inviting that nice trainer from the gym she'd mentioned before, Brian, of course. "I thought you two should meet," she said to Derek with practiced casualness. "He's starting his own business, and you might find his ideas interesting." Derek agreed readily, watching Claudia's face light up with the thrill of successfully manipulating him. She had no idea she was walking into an execution. The night of the party, Derek positioned himself perfectly. He'd arranged for Marcus Webb to be working as part of the catering staff, equipped with recording devices and positioned to capture everything that happened. Legal in their state, with proper disclosure buried in the catering contract Claudia had signed without reading. Claudia was radiant that evening, playing her role as the perfect hostess with theatrical precision. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting compliments on her appearance and the party's elegance. When Brian arrived, she introduced him to Derek with just the right amount of enthusiasm, enough to seem helpful, not enough to appear suspicious. Brian played his part well too, presenting himself as a successful entrepreneur with plans for expanding into high-end fitness centers. He was charming, articulate, and just humble enough to seem authentic. Under different circumstances, Derek might have been impressed by the performance. But Derek had spent 20 years reading people, and he could see the calculation behind Brian's smile, the practiced way he touched Claudia's arm when he thought no one was looking, the subtle signals they exchanged across the room. As the evening progressed, Derek began to plant seeds. Casual comments to the other wives about how much time Claudia had been spending at the gym. Offhand remarks about marriage being built on trust and honesty. Seemingly innocent observations about how people weren't always what they appeared to be. The other guests, unaware they were part of a larger performance, responded exactly as Derek had predicted. They began to watch Claudia and Brian more closely, noting the familiarity between them, the way they seemed to anticipate each other's movements. By the end of the evening, several people had begun to suspect something, though they couldn't quite identify what. Derek had created the perfect foundation for what was coming next, a room full of witnesses who would remember this night when the truth finally emerged. As the last guests departed, Claudia glowed with satisfaction. "That went perfectly," she said, kicking off her heels. "Everyone was so impressed. And I think you and Brian really hit it off." Derek nodded thoughtfully. "He's certainly interesting. We should definitely explore some business opportunities together." Claudia's smile was triumphant. She thought she'd successfully manipulated Derek into her and Brian's trap. Instead, she'd just lit the fuse on her own destruction. Derek excused himself to his office, ostensibly to review some contracts, but but actually to review the footage Marcus had captured. Every interaction between Claudia and Brian was documented in perfect detail. The lingering touches, the whispered conversations, the way they coordinated their movements like dancers following a familiar routine. More importantly, Derek had captured Brian's pitch on video. The fraudulent business proposal was now documented evidence, complete with witnesses who could testify to the circumstances. When Derek was ready to move, he'd have everything needed to pursue criminal charges against Brian for attempted fraud. As Derek sat in his office, studying the evidence of his wife's betrayal one final time before moving to the next phase, he felt no sadness, no regret. Claudia and Brian had made their choices. They'd chosen deception over honesty, greed over loyalty, immediate gratification over long-term consequences. Now Derek would show them what those choices really cost. The trap was set. Tomorrow, he would begin springing it. Chapter 4. The Snare Tightens. Derek Morrison had always believed that the most effective traps were the ones that convinced the prey to walk into them willingly. Over the following week, he began implementing the next phase of his plan with the patience of a master strategist who knew that timing was everything. The key was making Claudia and Brian believe they were winning. Derek started by expressing newfound interest in Brian's fitness center proposal. He arranged a meeting at his office, ostensibly to discuss investment opportunities, but actually to gather more evidence of the fraud. Brian arrived dressed in an expensive suit that probably represented a significant portion of his income, armed with glossy brochures and financial projections that looked impressive to the untrained eye. The luxury fitness market is exploding, Brian explained, spreading documents across Derek's conference table. High-net-worth individuals are willing to pay premium prices for exclusive experiences. We're talking about a membership fee of $50,000 per year, with a waiting list that ensures prestige. Derek played his role perfectly, asking probing questions that allowed Brian to elaborate on the fraudulent scheme. The business plan was sophisticated. Property leases that didn't exist, equipment purchases from companies that were shells, operating projections based on completely fabricated market research. Brian had clearly done this before. The initial investment requirement is $2 million, Brian continued, his confidence growing as Derek seemed increasingly interested. But the projected returns are extraordinary. We're looking at a 30% profit margin within 18 months. Derek nodded thoughtfully, making notes that Brian assumed were calculations, but were actually observations about his demeanor, his tells, the way his voice changed when he lied. I need to do my due diligence, of course. Review the property contracts, verify the equipment suppliers, maybe visit some of your other facilities. For just a moment, Brian's mask slipped. Derek caught the flash of panic before the smooth smile returned. Of course, although I should mention we're working under a tight timeline. The property lease has a deadline, and we have other potential investors who are very interested. The classic pressure tactic. Derek smiled inwardly while maintaining an expression of thoughtful concern. I understand. Claudia mentioned you're quite successful in this field. Perhaps she could show me some of your existing locations. Actually, Brian said carefully, I prefer to keep my business and personal relationships separate. Claudia's been helpful in making this introduction, but I think it's better if we handle the business aspects directly. Derek filed that away for later use. Brian was smart enough to try limiting Claudia's direct involvement in the fraud, probably planning to blame everything on miscommunication if the scheme unraveled. But Derek had no intention of letting either of them escape responsibility. The meeting ended with Derek promising to review the materials and get back to Brian within a week. As Brian left, Derek could see the excitement in his eyes. He thought he'd successfully hooked a wealthy mark. That evening, Claudia was unusually attentive, asking about Derek's day and showing interest in his work that had been absent for months. When Derek mentioned his meeting with Brian, her face lit up with carefully controlled enthusiasm. Oh, how did it go? He seems so knowledgeable about the fitness industry. Very impressive, Derek replied, watching her reaction. I'm seriously considering investing. It could be quite lucrative. Claudia's smile was brilliant, and Derek realized with cold clarity that her happiness wasn't about his potential success. It was about the success of her deception. She thought she was manipulating him into making a decision that would benefit her lover while simultaneously stealing from her husband. Over the next few days, Derek implemented the psychological component of his plan. He began appearing at the gym where Claudia and Brian typically met, establishing a routine that made their clandestine encounters increasingly difficult. He hired a different personal trainer and made a point of mentioning his new workout schedule to Claudia. The effect was immediate. Claudia became visibly stressed, making excuses to avoid the gym or finding reasons to change her schedule. Derek could see her growing paranoia in the way she checked her phone constantly, the tension in her shoulders, the forced brightness of her smile. Brian, meanwhile, was dealing with his own pressure. Derek had begun making inquiries about Brian's business references, ostensibly as part of his due diligence, but with the real goal of alerting Brian's previous victims to his presence in the city. 3 women had already contacted Derek, sharing stories of investment scams and emotional manipulation that painted a clear picture of Brian's methods. But Derek's masterstroke came when he arranged for Tyler to spend more time at home. Derek began working from his home office more frequently, creating an environment where Claudia and Brian could never be certain of their privacy. Tyler, still keeping their secret, would often appear at unexpected moments, his presence a constant reminder of the risk Claudia was taking. The stress began to show in Claudia's behavior. She became snappish with Tyler, impatient with Derek, and increasingly careless about maintaining her facade. She started drinking more wine at dinner, staying up late on her phone, and making excuses to leave the house that became increasingly transparent. Derek documented everything. The financial records of her increased alcohol purchases, photographs of her leaving the house at odd hours, recordings of phone conversations where she could be heard arguing with someone, presumably Brian, about timing and being more careful. The final element of this phase was social pressure. Derek began inviting friends and business associates to impromptu gatherings, ensuring that Claudia was constantly in situations where she had to perform the role of the devoted wife, while knowing that Derek was potentially closing a business deal with her lover. The strain was enormous. Derek could see it in the way Claudia's hands shook slightly when she served drinks, in the brittle quality of her laughter, in the way she avoided meeting his eyes during conversations about trust and loyalty. Brian was faring no better. Derek's investigation had spooked him enough that he'd begun pushing Claudia to accelerate their timeline. The pressure was causing cracks in their relationship, with both of them beginning to blame the other for the increased risk and diminishing opportunities. Derek received confirmation that his strategy was working when Marcus Webb reported overhearing a heated argument between Claudia and Brian in the parking lot of a restaurant across town. The conversation, recorded from a safe distance, revealed the growing desperation in their relationship. "He's getting suspicious," Claudia's voice was strained. "The way he keeps showing up at the gym, asking questions about you. And Tyler's been acting strange, watching me all the time." "You're being paranoid," Brian replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "He's a businessman. This is how they operate. They investigate before they invest." $2 million, Brian. "If we get caught before he transfers the money." "We won't get caught. You just need to keep playing the perfect wife for a few more weeks. Once the money's transferred, we can disappear together. Start fresh somewhere he'll never find us." Derek listened to the recording with grim satisfaction. They were planning to steal his money and abandon Tyler. Whatever sympathy he might have felt for Claudia as a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage evaporated completely. She was willing to destroy their son's life for money and a man who collected married women like trophies. That conversation sealed their fate. Derek had been considering various levels of punishment, different degrees of exposure and consequence. But learning that Claudia was prepared to abandon Tyler removed any possibility of mercy. Phase 4 would be devastating, and Derek would feel no guilt about what was coming next. As he sat in his office that night, reviewing the evidence that would destroy 2 lives, Derek felt the cold satisfaction of a man who had built an unassailable case. Claudia and Brian had provided him with everything he needed: evidence of adultery, attempted fraud, conspiracy to steal marital assets, and plans to abandon a minor child. They thought they were close to victory. Instead, they were about to discover what defeat looked like when inflicted by someone who understood that mercy was a luxury reserved for those who showed loyalty. The trap was about to spring, and Derek Morrison never left his enemies wounded. He left them destroyed. Chapter 5. The deception deepens. Derek Morrison understood that the most devastating battles were won not through single decisive strikes, but through systematic dismantling of the enemy's position until collapse became inevitable. As October progressed, He orchestrated a symphony of psychological pressure that pushed Claudia and Brian toward increasingly desperate measures. The genius of Derek's approach lay in its invisibility. To outside observers, he appeared to be the same devoted husband and father he'd always been, perhaps even more attentive than usual. But every gesture of affection toward Claudia was calculated, every family activity designed to increase her guilt and paranoia, every business discussion with Brian crafted to deepen the fraudulent investment scheme. Derek began hosting weekly family dinners, inviting his parents and Claudia's sister Rebecca to join them. The gatherings served multiple purposes. They demonstrated Derek's commitment to family values for the eventual custody battle. They prevented Claudia from meeting Brian during peak evening hours, and they created opportunities for Derek to plant seeds of doubt about Claudia's behavior in the minds of people who mattered. Claudia seems tired lately, Derek mentioned to Rebecca during one such dinner, his voice carefully laced with concern. She's been working out so much, staying out late with that book club. I worry she's pushing herself too hard. Rebecca, who had always been protective of her younger sister, began watching Claudia more closely. She noticed the tension, the way Claudia jumped when her phone buzzed, the forced quality of her interactions with Derek and Tyler. When Rebecca tried to discuss it privately with Claudia, she was met with defensive anger that only increased her suspicions. Meanwhile, Derek continued his elaborate courtship of Brian's investment proposal. He arranged for increasingly detailed meetings, bringing in his financial advisor and attorney to review the materials. Each meeting required Brian to elaborate further on his fraudulent scheme, creating a more detailed paper trail of criminal intent. Brian's desperation was becoming visible. The timeline for the investment was slipping, and Derek's thorough due diligence was making it impossible for Brian to maintain his facade indefinitely. During their third major meeting, Derek noticed sweat beading on Brian's forehead despite the cool October weather. I've identified some discrepancies in your equipment supplier contracts, Derek said, spreading documents across his conference table. The company listed as your primary vendor doesn't seem to exist at the address provided. Brian's pause was barely perceptible, but Derek caught it. That's odd. Let me check with my assistant. There might have been a transcription error in the address. Derek nodded sympathetically. These things happen. I'll have my team verify all the vendor information before we proceed. We're talking about a significant investment, so I'm sure you understand the need for absolute accuracy. Each layer of investigation forced Brian to create new lies, to fabricate additional supporting documentation, to dig himself deeper into a hole that Derek was carefully constructing. The beauty was that Brian couldn't back out without losing his chance at the money, but he couldn't proceed without exposing himself to additional criminal liability. The pressure was affecting Brian's relationship with Claudia as well. Their meetings became arguments about risk and timing, with each blaming the other for the complications. Derek learned about these conflicts through Marcus Webb surveillance, which had expanded to include audio recording of their encounters at various motels around the city. The recordings revealed the ugly truth about their relationship. Brian was openly contemptuous of Claudia when they were alone, calling her needy and paranoid, and expressing frustration with her emotional demands. Claudia, for her part, was beginning to realize that Brian's promises about their future together might be as fabricated as his business proposals. You said we'd go to Costa Rica once the money came through. Claudia's voice was petulant on one recording. Start a new life together. But lately you seem more interested in the money than in me. The money is how we start that new life, Brian replied coldly. Unless you'd rather keep playing house with your husband and pretend you're happy. Derek filed away that exchange for future use. When the time came to present evidence of Claudia's betrayal, her own words would demonstrate that she'd been planning to abandon Tyler for months. But Derek's most sophisticated manipulation involved Tyler himself. Without revealing the truth about what they'd witnessed together, Derek began spending more quality time with his son, creating positive memories that would help Tyler through the difficult period ahead. They went to baseball games, built model airplanes, and had long conversations about loyalty and trust. Dad? Tyler asked one evening as they worked on a particularly complex model. Why do some people break promises? Derek considered his answer carefully. Sometimes people make promises they don't really mean to keep. They want something so badly that they'll say anything to get it, even if they know they're lying. Tyler nodded solemnly. That's not fair to the people who believe them. No, it's not. That's why it's important to be careful about who you trust, and to remember that actions matter more than words. These conversations served dual purposes. They prepared Tyler for the emotional trauma that was coming while simultaneously building a record of Derek's involvement in his son's moral education. Any custody evaluator would see Derek as the stable, present parent who prioritized his child's well-being. As November approached, Derek implemented the final phase of his psychological campaign. He began making subtle changes to the house that only Claudia would notice, rearranging items in her dresser, moving her jewelry to different locations, slightly adjusting the positioning of her personal belongings. The changes were minor enough to create doubt about whether they'd happened at all, but consistent enough to create a growing sense of unease. Claudia began asking Derek if he'd been in her personal spaces, questions he answered with puzzled concern. "Are you feeling all right? You seem anxious lately. Maybe you should see Dr. Martin. Stress can manifest in all sorts of ways." The gaslighting was cruel but necessary. Derek needed Claudia to question her own judgment, to become increasingly unstable and erratic. When the truth finally emerged, her emotional state would work against her in custody proceedings and divorce negotiations. The effectiveness of Derek's strategy became apparent when Claudia began making mistakes. She forgot to delete text messages, left credit card receipts in places Derek would find them, and became increasingly careless about maintaining her alibis. The woman who had successfully conducted a secret affair for months was cracking under the pressure of Derek's invisible assault. The breaking point came when Claudia confronted Derek directly about his behavior, accusing him of spying on her and becoming obsessive about their relationship. The confrontation took place in their kitchen after Tyler had gone to bed, and Derek was prepared for it. "I don't understand what you're talking about," Derek said calmly. "I'm concerned about you, Claudia. You've been acting strange for weeks. Paranoid, defensive, secretive. That's not like you." "I'm not paranoid." Claudia's voice rose dangerously. "You've been watching me, following me, checking up on me constantly." Derek's expression was perfectly calibrated, concerned, confused, slightly hurt. "I've been trying to spend more time with my family. I thought you'd be happy about that. But if my presence is making you uncomfortable, maybe we should talk to someone together." The suggestion of couples therapy sent Claudia into a panic. She couldn't risk exposing their relationship to professional scrutiny when she was hiding such a massive deception. Her refusal to consider therapy would later be used as evidence of her unwillingness to work on their marriage. As Claudia stormed out of the kitchen, Derek felt the cold satisfaction of a master strategist who had successfully manipulated his opponent into making exactly the wrong move. Her emotional outburst had been witnessed by Tyler, who emerged from his room to ask if everything was okay. Derek knelt to Tyler's level, projecting calm reassurance while knowing that this moment would be remembered when custody decisions were made. "Mommy's just stressed about some things. Sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to work through." Tyler nodded, but Derek could see the worry in his son's eyes. The child was beginning to understand that his family was in danger, even if he didn't fully comprehend the threat. That night, as Derek reviewed his recordings and documents, he felt the grim satisfaction of someone who had built an unassailable case. Claudia and Brian were walking into his trap with increasing desperation, making more mistakes each day, providing more evidence of their guilt and their plans to destroy his family. The final phase was ready to begin. Derek Morrison had spent months building his case with methodical precision, and now it was time to present the evidence to the world. Claudia thought she was weeks away from stealing $2 million and starting a new life with her lover. Instead, she was about to discover what happened when someone betrayed Derek Morrison's trust. Chapter 6: The Web Unravels. Derek Morrison had learned long ago that the most effective revelations came not from dramatic confrontations, but from allowing the truth to emerge naturally, like water finding cracks in a foundation. As November deepened into winter, he began the delicate process of positioning all the pieces for maximum devastation while maintaining his facade of ignorant husband and potential investor. The key was timing. Derek needed Brian to commit fully to the fraudulent investment before exposing the affair, ensuring maximum criminal liability while simultaneously destroying Claudia's position in their divorce. He also needed to ensure that Tyler was protected from the worst of the fallout, which meant careful coordination with child services and family court officials. Derek's first move was seemingly innocuous. He announced to Claudia that he'd decided to proceed with Brian's investment proposal and would be transferring the $2 million by the end of November. The effect on Claudia was electric. She lit up with excitement that she tried desperately to hide, suddenly becoming more affectionate than she'd been in months. "That's wonderful, darling," she said, actually kissing him spontaneously. "Brian seems so knowledgeable. I'm sure it will be a great investment." Derek noted the kiss for later analysis. In 6 months of marriage counseling sessions that would never happen, that moment of genuine enthusiasm for her husband's financial loss would be difficult to explain. But Derek's announcement served a deeper purpose. He'd actually arranged for the money to be transferred into an escrow account controlled by his attorney, with release contingent on verification of all business documents and property contracts. Brian would believe he'd successfully stolen $2 million, would likely attempt to access the funds immediately, and would thereby provide definitive proof of criminal intent. Meanwhile, Derek arranged for an elaborate Thanksgiving dinner that would serve as the stage for the revelation he'd been orchestrating for months. He invited both extended families, several close friends, and, at Claudia's enthusiastic suggestion, Brian himself. "It's perfect," Claudia explained. "Brian doesn't have family in the area, and since you're going into business together, he should be part of our celebration." Derek agreed readily, knowing that Brian's presence at their family gathering would make the eventual revelation even more devastating. The contrast between the warm family atmosphere and the ugly truth would create maximum impact. Claudia threw herself into planning the dinner with manic energy, clearly viewing it as a celebration of her successful manipulation. She hired professional caterers, bought expensive wine, and decorated their home with obsessive attention to detail. Derek watched her preparations with cold fascination, knowing that she was essentially decorating for her own destruction. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Derek received the call he'd been waiting for. Brian had attempted to access the escrowed funds, providing bank routing information and demanding immediate transfer. When Derek's attorney explained that the money was contingent on document verification, Brian became increasingly agitated, eventually threatening legal action if the funds weren't released immediately. The recorded phone conversation was perfect evidence of criminal intent. Brian's desperation, his threats, his complete inability to provide legitimate documentation, all captured in his own words for later use in court. But Derek wasn't finished. He arranged a final meeting with Brian ostensibly to resolve the documentation issues, but actually to gather the last pieces of evidence he needed. The meeting took place in Derek's office, with hidden cameras recording every word. "I'm concerned about these discrepancies," Derek said, spreading fabricated documents across his desk. "My attorney found several irregularities that need to be addressed before we can release the funds." Brian's mask finally slipped completely. "What kind of irregularities?" "Everything was verified before we signed the initial agreement." "Well, for instance, the property ownership documents don't match the county records. And these equipment invoices, the serial numbers don't exist in the manufacturer's database." Derek watched Brian's face cycle through confusion, anger, and finally desperate calculation. The man was realizing that his carefully constructed fraud was unraveling, but he'd committed so deeply that backing out would be almost as damaging as being exposed. "There must be some mistake," Brian said finally. "Let me contact my associates and get updated documentation." Derek nodded sympathetically. "Of course, but I should mention that my attorney has suggested involving the authorities if we can't resolve these issues. Investment fraud is a serious matter, and he wants to protect both of us from any potential liability." The threat hit Brian like a physical blow. Derek could see the exact moment when Brian realized he'd been played, when the confident predator understood that he'd become prey. But by then it was too late. Brian had already committed multiple felonies, and Derek had every conversation, every document, every criminal act documented in exquisite detail. The meeting ended with Brian promising to provide clarification by Thanksgiving Day, a promise they both knew he couldn't keep. That evening, Derek observed Claudia's behavior with clinical interest. She was clearly communicating with Brian about the meeting, her face cycling through worry, anger, and desperate planning. Derek could see her struggling with the realization that their scheme might be failing, but unable to abandon it without losing everything she'd invested in the relationship. The stress was destroying her ability to maintain her facade. She snapped at Tyler over trivial issues, drank too much wine at dinner, and spent hours on her phone having whispered conversations that she thought Derek couldn't hear. Derek documented everything, building a comprehensive picture of a woman whose priorities had become completely distorted. Her behavior toward Tyler alone would be damaging in custody proceedings. The recordings showed a mother more concerned with her criminal boyfriend's problems than her own child's well-being. On Thanksgiving morning, Derek implemented the final phase of his plan. He contacted Marcus Webb and arranged for comprehensive surveillance of the holiday dinner, ostensibly for family documentation, but actually to capture the moment when the truth emerged. He also alerted his attorney, Helen Rodriguez, to be available for emergency legal filings. The dinner began perfectly. Both families gathered in Derek's elegantly decorated home, sharing stories and expressing gratitude for their blessings. Claudia played the perfect hostess, Brian charmed the guests with his practiced social skills, and Derek maintained his role as the successful patriarch surrounded by loved ones. Tyler, still keeping their secret, watched the proceedings with the solemn intensity of a child who sensed that important events were unfolding. Derek had prepared his son as much as possible without revealing the full truth, explaining that some grown-up problems might need to be discussed soon. As the meal progressed, Derek began introducing subtle elements of tension. He mentioned his business relationship with Brian, expressing enthusiasm about their investment partnership. He talked about trust and loyalty in relationships, observing how both Claudia and Brian reacted to the themes. He made casual references to marriage counseling and the importance of honesty in family relationships. The psychological pressure was enormous. Derek could see both of his targets becoming increasingly uncomfortable, their conversation forced, their smiles brittle. Several family members began to notice the tension, asking if everything was all right. The breaking point came when Derek's father, a retired judge with sharp instincts for human behavior, made an observation that cut too close to the truth. "Claudia seems anxious tonight. And you, young man," he said to Brian, "look like someone who's carrying the weight of the world." Brian attempted a laugh that came out forced and hollow. "Just some business concerns. Nothing that can't be resolved." Derek's father studied Brian with the penetrating gaze that had served him well on the bench. "In my experience, business problems that affect you at family gatherings are usually more personal than professional." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Derek could see Claudia struggling not to react, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her wine glass. Brian's jaw tightened, and for a moment Derek thought he might actually confess under the pressure of being seen so clearly. Instead, Brian excused himself to use the restroom, and Claudia followed shortly after, claiming she needed to check on dessert. Derek allowed them a few minutes to panic together before setting the final trap. The revelation would come not from Derek's accusations, but from their own actions, their own choices, their own inability to maintain their deception under scrutiny. Derek had spent months building toward this moment, and now everything was in place for the destruction that Claudia and Brian had brought upon themselves. As Derek sat at his Thanksgiving table, surrounded by family and friends who had no idea they were about to witness the systematic dismantling of a marriage, he felt the cold satisfaction of perfect preparation. Claudia and Brian thought they were minutes away from salvaging their scheme and their relationship. Instead, they were about to discover that Derek Morrison never forgave betrayal and never left his enemies standing. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. Derek Morrison had always believed that justice delayed was justice denied, and as his Thanksgiving dinner reached its crescendo, he prepared to deliver a verdict that had been months in the making. The dining room was filled with the warm sounds of family conversation, but Derek could feel the undercurrent of tension radiating from Claudia and Brian like heat from a fire. When they returned from their whispered conference, both looked pale and shaken. Derek suspected they'd made a decision to accelerate their timeline, perhaps planning to disappear together immediately after the holiday. It was exactly the kind of desperate move he'd been counting on. "Before we have dessert," Derek announced, rising from his chair with his wine glass, "I'd like to make a toast to family loyalty and the bonds that truly matter." The words hit Claudia like physical blows. Derek could see her struggle to maintain her composure as the gathered family raised their glasses. Brian's hand was visibly shaking as he lifted his wine. "To the people we can count on," Derek continued, his eyes moving deliberately between Claudia and Brian, and to the consequences that await those who betray trust. Derek's father frowned, sensing the unusual tension in his son's words. Rebecca studied her sister's face, finally recognizing the signs of guilt she'd been puzzling over for weeks. Tyler watched his father with wide eyes, understanding that the moment they'd been waiting for was finally arriving. As the family drank, Derek set down his glass and moved to the sideboard where he'd placed a manila envelope. Actually, I have some business to discuss with Brian. I hope everyone will forgive the timing, but some matters can't wait. Derek returned to the table and opened the envelope, removing a stack of photographs and documents. He placed them carefully in front of Brian, ensuring that everyone could see they were official-looking papers. I received some interesting information from my attorney today, Derek said conversationally. It seems there are some serious problems with our investment agreement. Brian's face went white as he recognized bank statements, phone records, and surveillance photographs. Derek had arranged them carefully. Not the most damaging evidence first, but enough to let Brian understand the scope of what Derek possessed. I'm not sure what you mean, Brian managed, his voice strained. Derek smiled coldly. Well, for instance, the property you claim to own for the fitness center? It doesn't exist. The business licenses you provided? Fabricated. The financial statements? Pure fiction. The silence in the dining room was deafening. Family members leaned forward, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Claudia sat frozen, her wine glass halfway to her lips. But that's not the most interesting discovery, Derek continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. The most interesting discovery is this. He placed a final photograph on the table, a clear surveillance shot of Claudia and Brian kissing passionately in a hotel parking lot, date stamped just 2 days earlier. Claudia's wine glass shattered on the floor. The explosion of questions and accusations that followed was everything Derek had orchestrated. His mother gasped. Rebecca shouted in dismay. Tyler ran to Derek's side with tears in his eyes. But Derek kept his attention focused on his primary targets. Brian made the mistake Derek had been hoping for. He tried to run. As he bolted toward the front door, Derek's father, drawing on decades of courtroom experience with fleeing defendants, called out in his authoritative judicial voice, "Sit down, young man, before you make this worse for yourself." The command stopped Brian in his tracks, and Derek's calm voice cut through the chaos. "Running would be a mistake, Brian. I've already contacted the authorities about the investment fraud. Your attempt to flee will only add to the charges." Brian turned back to the dining room, his face a mask of desperate calculation. "You can't prove anything. It's all circumstantial." Derek interrupted by placing a small recording device on the table. "Actually, I have recordings of every conversation we've had, including your detailed explanations of the fraudulent scheme. My attorney assures me it's more than enough for criminal prosecution." The recording device was the final psychological blow. Brian collapsed into his chair, finally understanding that he'd been systematically trapped by someone who planned 3 moves ahead of his opponents. Claudia found her voice at last, but only to reveal the depth of her selfishness. "Derek, please, let me explain. It's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," Derek replied, his voice carrying absolute finality. 6 months of adultery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and plans to abandon our son for money and a man who collects married women like trophies. Derek's father leaned forward, his judicial instincts taking over. "Son, what exactly are we dealing with here?" Derek opened the manila envelope fully, revealing the complete scope of his evidence. Investment fraud, attempted theft of marital assets, adultery, and conspiracy. I have financial records, surveillance footage, recorded conversations, and testimony from 3 of Brian's previous victims. As Derek systematically presented the evidence, the family watched in stunned silence. The photographs documented the affair in painful detail. The financial records showed Claudia using marital funds to support her relationship with Brian. The recorded conversations revealed their plans to steal Derek's money and disappear together. Most damning of all were the text messages Derek read aloud. Messages where Claudia and Brian mocked Derek's trust and made cruel jokes about his devotion to their family. The contrast between the devoted wife Claudia had pretended to be and the calculating woman revealed in her own words was devastating. "My God, Claudia," Rebecca whispered, staring at her sister in horror. "How could you do this to Derek?" to Tyler. But Claudia's response revealed everything Derek had suspected about her true nature. Instead of remorse or shame, she showed only anger at being caught. You don't understand what it's like being married to someone who loves his work more than his family. I felt invisible in my own home. Derek's mother, a woman who had been married to Derek's father for 45 years through various challenges, spoke with quiet disgust. Every marriage has difficulties, dear. Adults work through them or seek counseling. They don't betray their families for money and excitement. As the family absorbed the full scope of the betrayal, Derek began implementing the final phase of his plan. He contacted Helen Rodriguez, who arrived within 30 minutes with legal documents that had been prepared months in advance. Divorce papers, custody agreements, restraining orders, everything needed to completely separate Derek's life from Claudia's. The police arrived shortly after, having been alerted by Derek's attorney. Brian was arrested on charges of investment fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft. The evidence Derek had assembled was so comprehensive that the prosecutor would later describe it as one of the most well-documented white-collar cases he'd ever seen. Claudia was not arrested, but she was served with divorce papers and a restraining order that required her to leave the family home immediately. Her access to their joint accounts was frozen, and her ability to see Tyler was restricted to supervised visitation pending a full custody evaluation. As the police led Brian away in handcuffs, he made one final attempt to shift blame. She came to me. She initiated everything. I was just. Derek cut him off with a look of pure contempt. You were a predator who chose the wrong victim. Every choice you made led to this moment. The evening ended with Claudia packing a suitcase under police supervision while Derek's family absorbed the reality of what they'd witnessed. Tyler stayed close to his father, finally understanding why they'd hidden under the desk together that day in October. As Claudia prepared to leave, she made one final appeal. Derek, please, we can work through this. Think about Tyler. Derek's response was delivered with absolute finality. Tyler is exactly who I was thinking about when I built this case against you. You were willing to abandon him for money and a man you'd known for 6 months. A man who had already betrayed 3 other families. Claudia's face crumpled as the full scope of her situation became clear. She would face a contentious divorce with minimal financial support, supervised visitation with her son, and social exile from the community where she'd built her identity. Her lover was facing federal fraud charges that would likely result in significant prison time. But Derek felt no sympathy. Claudia had made her choices deliberately, repeatedly, over months of deception. She'd prioritized her desires over her family's well-being and had been willing to steal from the man who'd provided for her for 15 years. As the door closed behind Claudia for the last time, Derek picked up Tyler and held him close. His son was crying, confused by the adult drama that had destroyed his family, but Derek would help him understand that some betrayals were unforgivable. Derek Morrison had spent his career destroying opponents who underestimated him, and tonight he'd applied those same skills to protect his family from people who viewed loyalty as weakness and trust as opportunity. The reckoning was complete, but Derek's work was far from finished. Chapter 8: The Price of Betrayal. Derek Morrison had always understood that destroying his enemies was only half the battle. The other half was ensuring they could never rebuild enough strength to threaten him again. In the weeks following Thanksgiving, he implemented a campaign of systematic dismantlement that left both Claudia and Brian facing consequences that extended far beyond legal proceedings. Brian's situation deteriorated rapidly. The federal fraud charges Derek had helped assemble carried a potential sentence of 15 to 20 years, and the prosecutor was aggressively pursuing maximum penalties. But Derek wasn't content to let the justice system handle everything. He used his extensive business network to ensure that Brian's reputation was destroyed in every relevant market. Derek's private investigator, Marcus Webb, had identified Brian's previous victims across 3 states. Derek coordinated with these women to file a class-action civil lawsuit that would strip Brian of any remaining assets. More importantly, Derek ensured that local news outlets received detailed information about Brian's pattern of targeting married women for elaborate fraud schemes. The media coverage was devastating. Brian's photograph appeared in newspapers and television reports as the face of romance fraud, a predator who seduced married women as part of elaborate investment scams. The publicity made it impossible for Brian to work in the fitness industry or any field requiring client trust. But Derek's most effective weapon against Brian was psychological. Through carefully orchestrated leaks, Derek ensured that Brian learned about every aspect of Derek's planning. How he'd been manipulated from their first meeting, how every conversation had been recorded, how Derek had played Brian's arrogance against him. The knowledge that he'd been outsmarted by someone he'd considered an easy mark was destroying Brian's self-image as thoroughly as the legal proceedings were destroying his freedom. Claudia's destruction was more subtle but equally comprehensive. Derek had spent years building their social network, and he used every connection to ensure that Claudia's behavior became common knowledge throughout their community. The story of her affair and fraud conspiracy spread through their country club, Tyler's school, and their professional circles with the efficiency of a wildfire. The financial aspects of the divorce were particularly brutal. Derek's careful restructuring of their assets meant that Claudia discovered most of their apparent wealth was actually owned by Derek's corporations and trusts. The family home, the luxury cars, even many of her personal belongings were technically company property that Derek controlled completely. Claudia's attempt to claim half of Derek's business assets failed when her attorney discovered the legal ownership structures Derek had created. Her own adultery and the evidence of fraud conspiracy further weakened her position, and the prenuptial agreement she'd signed without careful review contained provisions that she'd forgotten about. The custody battle was equally one-sided. Tyler's testimony about discovering the affair, combined with recordings of Claudia prioritizing her relationship with Brian over her son's well-being, created an overwhelming case for Derek's sole custody. The court-appointed psychologist found that Claudia showed narcissistic tendencies and poor judgment regarding her child's emotional needs. Derek's most devastating attack on Claudia was exposing her true nature to the people whose opinions she valued most. Her sister Rebecca publicly distanced herself from Claudia after learning about the planned abandonment of Tyler. Claudia's parents, prominent members of their church community, were horrified by the evidence of their daughter's deception and fraud conspiracy. The social isolation was crushing for someone who had built her identity around being admired and envied by others. Claudia found herself excluded from social events, dropped from charitable boards, and avoided by former friends who didn't want to be associated with scandal. But Derek's masterpiece was ensuring that Claudia understood exactly how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. Through Helen Rodriguez, Derek sent Claudia a detailed timeline showing how he'd manipulated every aspect of their relationship from the moment Tyler alerted him to the affair. She learned about the surveillance, the recorded conversations, the way Derek had used her own vanity and greed to trap her. The psychological impact was devastating. Claudia realized that for months, while she thought she was manipulating Derek, he had been systematically documenting her every betrayal and building an unassailable case against her. The woman who had prided herself on her ability to deceive others discovered she'd been completely transparent to someone who understood manipulation better than she ever could. Derek received regular reports about both of his former enemies through Marcus Webb's continued surveillance. Brian had developed severe depression and anxiety, unable to cope with the realization that his carefully cultivated image as a successful predator had been completely shattered. He'd attempted to contact his previous victims seeking some kind of reconciliation, but Derek had prepared them for this possibility, and their unified rejection had destroyed Brian's last hope of rebuilding his self-image. Claudia's deterioration was more gradual but equally complete. Cut off from the social status and financial security that had defined her life, she was working as a receptionist at a medical clinic and living in a modest apartment across town. Her supervised visits with Tyler were awkward and painful, as her son struggled to understand why his mother had been willing to abandon him for a stranger. The most satisfying reports came from observing how the stress had affected the relationship between Claudia and Brian. Faced with the reality of their situation, their romantic delusions had evaporated completely. Brian blamed Claudia for being too obvious and attracting Derek's suspicion. Claudia blamed Brian for being too greedy and pushing for the investment fraud that had exposed them both. Their final confrontation, recorded by Marcus Webb in the parking lot of the courthouse where Brian's criminal trial was being held, revealed the ugly truth about their relationship. When stripped of the excitement of deception and the fantasy of stolen wealth, they had nothing but mutual recrimination and contempt. "You destroyed my life," Claudia screamed at Brian. "I had everything. A beautiful home, financial security, respect in the community. Now I have nothing because of your stupid scheme." Brian's response was equally bitter. "You came to me, remember? You were the one who was bored with your perfect life, who wanted excitement and danger. Don't blame me because you weren't smart enough to play the game without getting caught." Derek watched the recording with cold satisfaction. They were destroying each other more effectively than he ever could, each refusing to accept responsibility for their choices, each blaming the other for consequences they'd brought upon themselves. As winter progressed, Derek focused on rebuilding his life with Tyler. His son was resilient, as children often are, but Derek ensured he received counseling to process the trauma of his family's destruction. More importantly, Derek made sure Tyler understood that his mother's choices were not his fault and that Derek's love for him was unconditional. The house felt lighter without Claudia's presence. Derek redecorated Tyler's room, created a home office that felt welcoming rather than utilitarian, and established new family traditions that belonged to just the two of them. Tyler responded positively to the stability and attention, his grades improving and his natural cheerfulness returning. Derek also began to rebuild his social life, attending community events and professional gatherings where his handling of the situation had enhanced rather than damaged his reputation. The consensus among his peers was that Derek had acted with admirable restraint and intelligence when faced with devastating betrayal. But Derek's greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that his enemies were learning a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Betraying Derek Morrison's trust carried consequences that extended far beyond what most people could imagine or survive. As he tucked Tyler into bed one December evening, Derek reflected on the events that had transformed their lives. He felt no regret about the thoroughness of his revenge. Claudia and Brian had made their choices with full knowledge of the harm they were causing. They'd been willing to destroy a child's family for money and excitement, and Derek had simply ensured they faced appropriate consequences. Tyler looked up at his father with eyes that held new wisdom about the adult world. "Dad, are you sorry about what happened to Mom?" Derek considered the question carefully. "I'm sorry that she made choices that hurt our family. But I'm not sorry that we discovered the truth, and I'm not sorry that she has to live with the consequences of her actions." Tyler nodded, processing this adult concept with the seriousness of a child who had witnessed real consequences for real betrayals. "She could have chosen to be better." "Yes," Derek agreed. "She could have. That's what makes her choices unforgivable." As Derek turned off the lights and prepared for bed, he felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had protected what mattered most while ensuring that those who threatened his family would never be in a position to harm anyone else again. The price of betraying Derek Morrison was complete destruction, and both Claudia and Brian were learning that some debts could never be paid in full. Chapter 9: The Final Judgment. 6 months after that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, Derek Morrison stood in his home office reviewing the final reports on his former enemy's complete downfall, feeling the cold satisfaction of perfect justice executed with surgical precision. The spring morning light streaming through his windows illuminated documents that told the story of 2 lives systematically destroyed by their own choices and Derek's relentless pursuit of consequences. Brian Hutchinson had been sentenced to 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The judge had specifically noted the predatory pattern of behavior targeting vulnerable married women and the sophisticated planning that endangered multiple families. Derek's comprehensive evidence had made conviction inevitable, and the prosecutor had used Derek's case as a model for pursuing similar crimes. But prison was only the beginning of Brian's punishment. The civil lawsuit coordinated by Derek had stripped Brian of every asset, leaving him with debts that would follow him long after his release. More devastating was the complete destruction of his identity as a successful predator. The prison system had a particular contempt for men who targeted women and children, and Brian's narcissistic personality was crumbling under the harsh reality of his new status. Derek's private investigator continued to monitor Brian through prison contacts, and the reports painted a picture of a broken man who spent his days in protective custody, paranoid and depressed, unable to maintain the charming facade that had been his primary weapon. The confident predator who had thought Derek would be an easy mark was now a fearful inmate counting down 18 years of consequences. Claudia's fate was more subtle, but equally complete. The divorce had been finalized with terms that left her financially devastated and socially ruined. Derek's careful asset protection meant she received only minimal support, barely enough to maintain a modest lifestyle, while Derek kept everything he'd built during their marriage. The custody arrangement was particularly brutal. Derek had been awarded full custody, with Claudia receiving limited supervised visitation that required her to prove her stability and fitness as a parent. The psychological evaluations had painted a damning picture of a woman whose narcissistic tendencies made her fundamentally unsuitable for parenting responsibilities. But Derek's most effective weapon against Claudia had been social destruction. In their close-knit community, reputation was everything, and Derek had systematically ensured that everyone who mattered knew exactly what Claudia had done. She'd been forced to move across the state to find work, living under the shadow of her scandal wherever she went. The final reports showed Claudia working multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet, isolated from former friends and family, struggling with depression and anxiety as she confronted the reality of her choices. The woman who had once commanded respect and admiration was now a cautionary tale about the consequences of betraying family loyalty. Most importantly for Derek, Tyler was thriving. His son had responded well to counseling and was excelling in school, sports, and social activities. The stability of Derek's sole custody had provided Tyler with the security he needed to process his trauma and move forward. Derek had been careful to never speak negatively about Claudia in Tyler's presence, allowing his son to form his own conclusions about his mother's character based on her actions. Tyler's relationship with Claudia during their supervised visits was cordial but distant. At 7 years old, Tyler understood that his mother had chosen to leave their family for someone else, and that understanding had created a protective emotional distance. Derek had ensured Tyler received therapy to process these complex feelings, but he also made sure Tyler understood that loyalty and trust were earned through consistent actions, not demanded through blood relations. Derek had also rebuilt his personal life with careful deliberation. He'd begun dating Sarah Mitchell, a family law attorney who understood the complexities of his situation and respected the fierce protectiveness he showed toward Tyler. Sarah was everything Claudia hadn't been: genuinely intelligent, professionally accomplished, and absolutely trustworthy. Their relationship developed slowly, with Tyler's well-being as the primary consideration. Sarah understood that she was dating a man who had learned painful lessons about trusting too easily, and she earned her place in their lives through patience, consistency, and genuine care for Tyler's happiness. The contrast between Sarah and Claudia was stark in every way that mattered. Where Claudia had been beautiful but shallow, Sarah was attractive but substantive. Where Claudia had been charming but manipulative, Sarah was warm but honest. Where Claudia had seen Derek's success as something to exploit, Sarah respected his achievements while building her own career. Derek's business had also flourished in the aftermath of his personal crisis. His handling of the situation had enhanced his reputation among his professional peers, who saw his methodical approach to protecting his family as evidence of the same strategic thinking that made him successful in business. Several major clients had specifically requested Derek's services after learning how he'd managed his personal crisis. But Derek's greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that his enemies understood exactly how thoroughly they'd been defeated. Through various channels, both Claudia and Brian had learned about Derek's planning, about how he'd manipulated their arrogance and greed to trap them completely. The knowledge that they'd been played by someone they'd considered an easy mark was destroying their self-image more effectively than any external punishment. Derek had received word through his attorney that Claudia had attempted to apologize and seek some kind of reconciliation, but Derek's response had been swift and final. Claudia Morrison made her choices with full knowledge of their consequences. She chose deception over honesty, greed over loyalty, and selfishness over family. There is no conversation to be had with someone who was willing to abandon their child for money and excitement. The message sent through Helen Rodriguez was clear: Derek would never forgive, never forget, and never provide Claudia with any opportunity to cause further harm to their son. As Derek reviewed the final chapter of his revenge, he felt no regret about the thoroughness of his response. Claudia and Brian had declared war on his family, and Derek had simply ensured they faced appropriate consequences. Their current suffering was entirely the result of choices they'd made freely, repeatedly, over months of calculated deception. Tyler appeared in the doorway of Derek's office, dressed for their Saturday morning baseball practice. At 7, he was already showing signs of Derek's analytical intelligence and strong moral compass, but with a warmth and openness that Derek was careful to nurture and protect. "Dad, are you ready to go?" Tyler asked, shouldering his baseball bag with practiced efficiency. Derek closed the files on his former enemies and turned his full attention to his son. "Absolutely. How's your batting stance coming along?" As they walked to the car together, Tyler looked up at his father with the direct gaze that reminded Derek so much of himself. "Dad, do you think Mom will ever understand why what she did was wrong?" The question showed Tyler's growing maturity and his need to understand the adult world he'd been forced to witness. Derek considered his answer carefully, knowing it would shape Tyler's understanding of accountability and consequences. "Understanding requires accepting responsibility for your actions," Derek said finally. "Some people are more interested in making excuses than learning from their mistakes. Your mother chose to blame other people for the consequences of her choices, which means she probably won't learn from them." Tyler nodded seriously. "So she might hurt other people the same way?" Derek felt a surge of pride at his son's moral reasoning. "It's possible. That's why it's important to choose the people you trust very carefully, and to remember that actions matter more than words." As they drove toward the baseball field, Derek reflected on the lessons Tyler was learning from this experience. His son was developing a sophisticated understanding of loyalty, trust, and consequences that would protect him throughout his life. Derek had ensured that Tyler would never be naive enough to trust blindly or ignore warning signs of deception. The baseball practice was exactly what Derek needed: 2 hours of simple father-son activity, surrounded by other families who valued loyalty and commitment. Derek watched Tyler work on his batting stance with the same methodical attention to detail that Derek brought to everything important in his life. As the practice ended and they packed up their equipment, Derek felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had protected what mattered most while ensuring that those who threatened his family would never be in a position to harm anyone else again. Tyler climbed into the passenger seat and buckled his seatbelt with practiced efficiency. "Dad, I'm glad it's just us now. Everything feels safer." Derek started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward their favorite lunch spot. "Trust has to be earned, Tyler. The people who truly deserve to be in your life will prove it through their actions, not their words." As they drove through their neighborhood, a place where Derek was respected, Tyler was loved, and their enemies were nothing but cautionary tales, Derek Morrison felt the profound satisfaction of perfect justice. He had built a new life on the ruins of the old one, protected his son from people who would have destroyed him for money and excitement, and ensured that betraying Derek Morrison's trust carried consequences that lasted a lifetime. Claudia and Brian had learned that some men could not be manipulated, used, or betrayed without facing complete destruction. They would spend the rest of their lives paying for their choices, while Derek and Tyler moved forward into a future built on genuine loyalty and earned trust. The price of betrayal had been collected in full, and Derek Morrison never offered refunds.